Hello, my name is Shanita Horton, and this is my final video for MIS605. And I'm basically about to walk you through the steps of our bike sharing system. The first thing that we did was to determine the business process. Then we went through and we chose the information system architecture, the software, the database components, and the hardware architecture. Next, we determined security risk. Then we designed a data structure and also a relational database. The first thing that we looked at with the business process was the rental system. Um, Basically, we talked about what or who would initiate the rental system. And for me, I decided to have the user initiate the rental system and the process. Um, and they would initiate that through the app when they decided to rent the bike. So basically, you go onto an app and you find the closest bike, and when you reserve the bike, at the end of the ride, uh, the billing process starts. But the actual rental process would start with the ride and be again initiated by the user. The overall bike rental process would track everything from the reservation and the rental duration, um, even track their bike's real-time location. So just like a person could find a bike that was available near them, the bike could also be located, and that would be taken care of by the actual um, rental process. The next thing that we talked about was the management information system. Um, the management information system would support uh, this process by collecting and reporting the data. Um, this is something that would allow us to identify trends. We could also find out which locations or which areas of the city people needed to people were renting bikes more often. All of these things would be determined by the data. So the management information system would take care of that just by collecting the data, and again also um, storing the data or reporting the data. Next was the user management system, which would be again initiated by the user. However, this time we're talking about management of payments, user registrations, discounts, the billing process. These things would be determined by the user management system. So, for example, if a person was to be an annual um, user versus someone that's just renting by the day. Uh, this would be determined. Uh, this would determine the price based upon their membership level. And again, this would all be handled by the user management system. The next thing that we talked about was the architecture, the information system architecture, the software, the database components, and the hardware architecture. When it came to the um, architecture, I chose the cloud architecture because it is easily scalable, um, it's dynamic, and it's low cost. So uh, it's known for its low entry costs, device independency, as well as the location independency. So once you're dealing with the cloud, you don't necessarily have to have a on-site server. Um, when it came to the software components, this would basically be the app that would be created. Again, this is something that's accessed on the user's phone, and also any APIs that would be used in the application. Also, security. So all of these things would be covered under the software components. When it comes to the database components, I chose to use a database management system, um, database, uh, a query processor, a runtime database manager. Um, all of these things would be taken care of, would fall under database components. Um, when it comes to the hardware, basically I chose to use a Raspberry Pi for with a tracker for the bikes. So each bike would be controlled by a Raspberry Pi. It would also have a lock on the back so that either if the bike was in use, it would be released, and then once it was stopped at the docking station, the lock would be on again. Also, at the kiosk, so that would be another form of hardware, a wireless router. The user would use a smartphone to access the application, and again, the docking stations or the docking posts would be considered um, to be hardware. Also, the card readers that would be located at the actual post. This is an example of the docking stations that I found, and I thought was really awesome because it gives you the impression that they are just located randomly around the interested um, party. So, for example, if this was on a college campus, these would be just located randomly on the college campus. Um, Again, you would be able to use your phone to find out which docking stations had bikes that were available. Um, and again, so the software would come on the phone and also at the kiosk. Um, Back to the hardware, which is showing that the hardware in this case would be the docking station, and again with the Raspberry Pi that can just be easily attached to a bike at the top of the handlebars. It could also double as a um, GPS system, so you would still need to create a user interface, which would fall under software. And if you were to choose to allow the riders to use GPS, that's something else that would have to be designed, and it would also um, fall under software. But the actual hardware, again, would be just this small Raspberry Pi, very inexpensive. You would also be able to put this touchscreen on the top and just throw it in a case and call it good. The next thing that we talked about were security risks. The main security risks that were identified would be data breaches, um, meaning uh, if a hacker was to hack into the system and somehow intercept the credit card information, Another thing that was identified was the data loss, or not having backup, human error, um, insecure API, and account hijacking. So to minimize these risks, the ability to limit access to specific parties, basically permissions. That's the number one way to minimize that. Um, Frequently monitoring the system, so basically having someone constantly checking to make sure that you haven't been hacked. Um, Storing data redundantly in multiple locations. While we are using the cloud architecture, it would also be a good idea to have some sort of backup setup using services like Amazon S3. Also minimize security risk, and properly training employees on how to um, be safe is another way to minimize security risk. Minimizing insecure APIs, using a database management system. Um, just really quickly running through a query processor, um, the runtime database manager, database engine, um, for the most part, and also keeping the backup cloud server so that we would be able to minimize the risk of data loss. Next, we talked about the actual system design. Um, we also did coding to basically determine the register, or to code the registration and also the billing. So this was a layout, or a information flow chart that we created. It basically tells us when the process starts and when it ends. Um, at when the new user initiates um, this process on the app, the first thing that you need to find out is basically if they're registered or not. If they are registered, then um, you're gonna go ahead and check the validation. If they're not registered, want to see if it's something that they're interested in. Um, Also, it talks about the discounts, which again, we coded this information by using objects, creating objects for this entire process. Um, so we were able to create conditional statements that basically says if registered, then log in. If not registered, then go proceed to the registration information. Um, and it just goes on to talk about the checking the validity and going towards the bike payment process. This is basically showing how I supported that design with code. So again, this is object-oriented code that created basically a um, user info object, um, goes through and talks about the user info, then the billing process, the registration process. All of this is what was laid out in the past slide. Then we talked about um, the database, we did talk about a relational database. This is just showing the relationship between ride history and a current rider. It also talks about how we would be able to determine whether or not a station um, had bikes in it or not. Next steps would be to get approval um, to select some site where we could have a backup server, um, choose the bike docking locations, get the hardware installed, develop the app, and then build the database.